All right, everybody. Good evening, 8 o'clock on our Tuesday evening. I'm 10 Tampa Bay Chief Meteorologist Bobby Deskins. I'm just about here, guys. I made it. I found some model plots that we've been talking about. Ross and Erin, thank you for joining us once again tonight. We were talking about Tropical Storm Erin, and we were just kind of chatting back and forth right there and finding out where were the ensemble models. Well, I found it. I just made it. And so that's what we'll talk about tonight. All right. Good to see you guys. How are you doing, Ross? How you doing, Erin?
Yeah, I'm doing good. I'm excited to be back with both of you here tonight.
Good, good. Erin, how are you doing?
You know, it's great to have both of you guys, but you know what? Something that South Carolina, that Florida's dealing with right now, summer weather is finally back. And it's hot, and it's humid, and it looks like it's going to be sticking around for a while before we even see anything that may be affecting any one of us from Erin.
Let's hope so, right? You got some of the Florida weather up there. So there have been a couple of changes today, and not very many, mainly in the forecast for Tropical Storm Erin. The storm itself hasn't been much of a change at all since the last time we talked to everybody at 8 o'clock last night. So I figure we'll start right there. I'll get you kind of caught up on where it is, what it looks like, and the track, and then we'll start shifting more over into what to expect from it. So you can see it's way out there right now. It's about 2,800 miles east-southeast of Florida at this time, okay? So it's way out there. My mother-in-law was like, oh, my friends want to know, we're scared of the storm. I'm like, well, no, nothing to be afraid of right now, okay? It's way offshore. And the modeling trend today has been one that's a little bit further to the south, but it still looks like it wants to recurve. So we're going to be following it out there. Now, right now, winds are only about 45 miles per hour, and that's what we had this time yesterday. The pressure is now at about 1,006 millibars. This time yesterday, we had pressure of 1,004. So the pressure's actually gone up, which is not a good thing for storms, right? It's a little bit weaker. However, there's still a pretty good little amount of moisture around the backside of it. You see right here, this is the water vapor, and all of that is dry air. That's basically Saharan dust that's been out ahead of it. So it's having a hard time. It's over cooler water, and it's running into some of this dry air here on the front end, but it does have some moisture on the south end, and there is some trying to wrap around. And eventually, I think some of this dust will get knocked out of the atmosphere just a little bit. You can see that's a pretty decent little envelope of moisture, at least right near the center. And you can see some pretty good convection trying to fire up tonight. That looks a whole lot better now than what it did earlier in the day. Okay, so let's jump back out. Let's go to the track right here. And you can see that basically we are looking at this thing moving off to the west, almost west-southwest. Right now it's moving to the west quickly at 22 miles per hour. And then it's going to take a little bit more of a turn to the west-northwest. And look at that intensity. You can see it's going to start to speed up a little bit, and then the intensity increases. We're going from yesterday at this time, we were thinking Wednesday night we would have our first hurricane. Now it looks like it's going to be Thursday night into Friday morning that we get our first hurricane. So we'll get the hurricane strength, and then after that, it's off to the races. Cat 3, 115 mile per hour winds by the time we get towards 2 o'clock in the afternoon on Sunday. Now, this cone has shifted a little bit further to the south. If you notice now, parts of the Northeast Islands and almost Puerto Rico are in part of the cone, the southern part. Now, real fast, we're going to talk tracks here in just a little bit with Ross, but what I want to impart on you is that the cone has nothing to do with the weather of the hurricane, right? The cone has to do with the amount of air the forecast has had over the last 5 years. And so the Hurricane Center thinks it's going to be right there, right at 2 p.m. on Saturday, right there at 2 p.m. on Sunday. And then they go back and they look at how much air they've had over the past 5 years. They take about 2/3 of that. It's kind of a crazy math equation to tell you about. But bottom line is, once they figure out that spot where they think it's going to be, they figure out the radius of how far off they've been on average. So what that means is they draw a circle around that spot, and that's why this is a circle right here. And then that means that the center, on average, could fall anywhere within this circle. It'll probably be closer to the middle, but that's what that means. Now, let's jump over. Ross, you want to take us into some of the forecast tracks, and I did just add the European ensembles on there, so you'll see those pop up here in just a second.
Yeah, well, they've been relatively consistent over the past couple of days, at least, over about that 3 to 5 day period. And we kind of expect that, right? But that consistency and that consensus of the track itself is taking most of the storm just to the north of the Lesser Antilles, right? So right around about the U.S. Virgin Islands and the northeastern sides of Puerto Rico is kind of when some of those storm tracks begin to diverge a little bit, or some of those spaghetti plots, so to speak. So we're expecting it to move just to the northeast of Puerto Rico, or at least just on the northern extent. And then the big question is, how much further west is it going to track? Does that Bermuda High stay a little bit stronger and somewhat further, across the central portion of the North Atlantic and steers it a little bit further west? Or does the Bermuda High shift a little bit further eastward and allows a gate to open, so to speak, for that recurving to the north, by early next week, Tuesday, Wednesday? So you'll notice that there are a few outliers, right? Some of the forecast models and spaghetti plots do take it a little bit closer to the Bahamas and even to the eastern seaboard of the U.S. But that's why I use the term outliers. Again, the consensus of the majority of the ensembles and these forecast models are showing that recurving to take place. And yeah, there's Bobby showing you a lot of those. So again, we're expecting it to reach the northern side of the Lesser Antilles. From there, it's really just trying to decide how quickly it begins that return north. And typically, once the storms do begin to strengthen and they start to turn, to the right, they will slow down in speed a little bit. Like a car, you can't just pull the e-brake and take the corner at 80 miles per hour. More often than not, as the storms strengthen, the centrifugal force within them got to slow down a little bit to begin that right turn. So we'll see if that, begins to occur and comes to fruition by the end of the weekend and even into early next week. But Bobby, I do want to ask you something before we move on too much further, mainly just because I've seen some things online recently that this storm is giving, people ideas of how Irma looked back in 2017, right? So I want you to just, and I didn't live here in Florida, when Irma impacted Tampa and a lot of folks. So can you maybe just get into a little bit of what is different with Erin in contrast to what, the placement of the Bermuda High was with Irma back in 2017 to maybe, not have people on edge thinking this is going to be an Irma situation all over again?
Yeah, well, I just went back and looked because one of the initial within the first 24 hours, I think, of the cones of Irma, which was 2017, by the way, they had something, I can't remember, it kind of went like this. I think it was something like that. And what that did was, what it was trying to do was coming in, see this little dip that you see here? It was trying to do that little dip, okay? And then it was trying to come up and out, like you're seeing right here. And then it was saying, well, it's going to try and come up, but then a ridge builds over top of it so that it comes back to the west, then it will eventually come up, all right? That happened a couple different times, so much so that eventually it ended up coming all the way over and just doing something like this. All right. And so what you're seeing there is what Ross was just talking about. You get this high pressure system set down here. Excuse this rough drawing of it, but there's your high pressure, right? And you can't go into it, right? But you're trying to go around it. And then when you get around, then you can go all the way up and around it. But if this high pressure doesn't break down enough here in the middle and it actually extends a little bit out here, you're going to start to come up and then high pressure builds back over top of it. So then you go back over to the west. For instance, you get another high developing right here. So you try and come out because you come around, you see a little weakness in here, but you're too far to the west, you get right back underneath it, you come back down and then you got to go back around again. That's essentially what Irma was doing. We don't have this second area of high pressure in place at this particular point. What we do have is one great big area of high pressure, right now at least, that extends something like this. All right? And then it actually, there's kind of another one sitting right here to it as well. But it's this area right in here that's going to break down. And then what we're going to be left with is a high pressure that is sitting something like this, and then another one that's sitting something like this. All right? That opens the door for this storm to recurve. Okay? And that's what we need. Now, since you brought up Irma, I'd be more concerned if this high was sitting, or even coming into the southeast here, because it's not just what it is right now, but it's what the atmosphere is going to look like when that storm gets here. So if the storm is trying to come up and all of a sudden this high here sits over here, you're going to push it back down and then back around. I don't see that right now. None of the models are really seeing that. And in fact, if you look at all these are the multiple runs of the European that's right here. You can see how many, that's Bermuda right here. And a lot of the runs are right there by Bermuda. That's further east than what the European model has been lately. But you can see there's a bunch that are still left out over here. So we'll have to see. The GFS models, they're right here near Bermuda, or maybe even the Ensembles a little bit to the east of it. So yes, overall, this track today, these models have actually shifted a little bit further to the south, closer to the Northeast Islands here. But even having done that, they all have a pretty good right-hand turn to turn to the north eventually and recurve. So Ross, great question there, man. I saw that and people were talking about it the other day and I thought, oh no. And so I went back and looked and I was not too worried once I saw what the forecast was then and what it is now.
Yeah.
You know, Bobby, it's interesting that you were talking about the ensembles, because you know, we go through and look at spaghetti plots all the time, and it's, well, there's a reason why it's called spaghetti plots, but you've got so many variations of so many different models. But in tradition, when we talk about, you know, the European model and the American GFS model, you know, we try to look at both of them and see what kind of variations they go day by day. But there have been quite a bit of variations that we've had, you know, just within the last 24 hours since we talked last night.
Yeah, and here's a look, Efren. If you want to look at those, that's a combination of the two. The green lines there are the European model, and the yellow are the GFS, and you can see them side by side there.
Now, if memory serves me correctly, last night, the GFS and the European models, position-wise by Monday, were actually flip-flop, where the Euro was more on the eastern directional, and the GFS was more on the western directional. In either case, both of them have shifted a little bit further north once they get into the northern Caribbean, as opposed to right along the Lesser Antilles, and then finally moving more towards the northwest and eventually more north-northwest by day 4 or 5, which would put it almost parallel to the Bahamas. Now it's shifted a little bit more, that it's more progressively towards the north earlier. Now, of course, this is going to change, but that's what's so interesting, that we've seen how the models have modified again, and that's the one thing that we're always going to have. When we are constantly looking at these models, they will shift, they will change dynamically depending on that one big thing that you showed, and Ross was alluding to it, that big old Bermuda high that right now is not so much over Bermuda, but is elongated from Bermuda all the way to the southeast Atlantic coast.
All right, so here is the run that as it went out there, and you can see that the GFS is well out ahead of it, and the European is still out behind it. But either way, guys, both of those runs, almost every one of the ensemble runs keeps it off of the East Coast at this particular time. So nothing set in stone, but we know that that obviously that's a good thing for right now. All right, you want to talk a little bit about the steering out there, Ross?
Yeah, well, we've kind of talked a little bit already about that Bermuda high that's going to be in place, and I kind of talked about it earlier today, you know, during some of our earlier newscasts. Is I grew up in agriculture and livestock, and I think of the Bermuda high almost as like a fence, and the storm itself is almost like your livestock, your cattle, your sheep, whatever it may be, and it kind of keeps that storm pinned to the south, and then as you alluded to, Bobby, by the time we approach kind of the end of the weekend and into early next week, the far western portion of that high gets pinched off. And you have an area of high pressure kind of draped across the Mississippi River Valley across the United States, and then that Bermuda high shifts much further eastward, allowing an open lane, or in the case of livestock, there's a gate along the fence, right? So the gate opens up, and that allows the storm to kind of funnel through it, whether they're sheep or cattle, whatever it may be, just trying to bring a nice little analogy to the story here. So, Bobby, you're showing it right there. A couple different tracks of that storm kind of getting pulled around the western side of that Bermuda High, and that's really what's kind of causing the recurving to the north of this storm, and why we're expecting that here. So, and I also just want to add, we kind of talked about the Euro and GFS models. I think it's important for folks who are watching at home, right? They might see one model run and lock it in. More often than not, in these situations, as Efren mentioned as well, they're going to change. Sometimes we'll see that windshield wiper effect, where one run it'll show it a little bit further west, and that might be the trend through the morning, and then by the afternoon and the evening hours, then it starts to come back to the east the other way. So always want to take them with a little bit of a grain of salt. Always try to look for the patterns and the trends within those model runs and ensembles over a couple of days, not just individual runs. Something always to keep in mind for all those at-home forecasters also trying to figure out where exactly Tropical Storm Erin's going to end up going.
Yeah, don't pick that one line that's pointing right at your house when there's 30 others that are going the other direction. Yeah, that is something easy to do for sure. So, Efren, let's talk about the intensity here, buddy. Right, 45 mile per hour winds right now, the same thing we had last night, and the pressure actually went up in the last 24 hours.
Right. So it's a tropical storm. It's not really doing anything. Really hasn't intensified over the last 24 hours when it was first named, but conditions are not as apt to where it is now to where it's actually going to go. The water temperatures, where its current position is in the upper 70s. We need water temperature, the ocean water temperature, to be 80, 81 degrees or higher. That is going to be the case at least in the next 36 to 48 hours, in which it's going to get into an environment in the central and then heading into the western portions of the Caribbean, where the water temperatures, that light red when it first gets in by Wednesday and Thursday, now the water temperatures are about 81, 82 degrees. But by Friday and into Saturday, now it's getting into water temperatures that are topping 84 to 86. And by Sunday, even though the cone only ends where the dark red hasn't shown up yet, now we're talking about water temperatures that are 86, and once we get into that area to the west and north of it, you're talking about water temperatures that are 88 degrees. Now, anybody who has been out in St. Augustine's Beach or just off the beach of St. Petersburg, water is 88, 89 degrees. You can definitely feel how warm that water is. Well, this warm water is the fuel for these tropical cyclones, these tropical storms, to become hurricanes, not only to intensify, but to maintain its structure and maintain its strength. Now, of course, we have upper level dynamics of wind shear, but when you're talking about the fuel to feed into the hurricane coming in from the ocean waters, well, we're not seeing that now. We are going to see it as we get into, especially by Thursday afternoon and going forward. Those waters are going to stay warm. And something that I remember that somebody asked, well, what if we have, like we had in the case of 2017, we have, and I think it was Gustav before Maria, but we had 3 hurricanes all almost in succession within a 2-week time frame of each other. Well, the waters may be 84, 86, 88 degrees, but there's something called upwelling. When you have a tropical cyclone that goes over the ocean, it actually stirs up the water from underneath. So the water may have been at a temperature of 86, 87 degrees, but if we have a tropical cyclone that moves through, it mixes that water. So a week or 2 weeks later, that water temperature may not be 88. It may be down to about 85 or 86. But we have not had yet any tropical storms, let alone hurricanes, that have come through from east to west through the Caribbean to stir up the water. That water has been untouched, even with tropical waves, and that warm water will definitely fuel Erin as it becomes that potential major Cat 3 hurricane.
Great point, man. And right now Erin's small, but as it intensifies, it should get a lot bigger as it becomes a Cat 2, Cat 3, and to have it kind of bowling ball through that area of very warm water. It would be nice to kind of upwell, right? It blows that top water off, and so the water underneath's got to come up to fill that. It would be nice to kind of cool off that whole area between North Carolina and Bermuda and east of the Bahamas. Efren, why don't you take us through the European and the GFS models for the surface winds to show us what that looks like, because it's going to get kind of close to some of those Caribbean islands. What are we kind of thinking about at this point?
Well, that's the thing. The cone, we showed the cone where in day 4, day 5, it was skirting right across the U.S. and British Virgin Islands all the way to Puerto Rico. Well, now let's talk about the winds, just the winds alone. As we get towards Thursday afternoon into Friday, the Lesser Antilles, so Antigua, Barbuda, both U.S. and British Virgin Islands, the winds are going to start picking up. Now, we're not talking about ferocious winds, but winds that are be gusting more than normal. So sustained winds of 15 to 20 miles an hour, well, that's a gentle breeze for the Caribbean islands, but the winds are going to be coming in initially from the north. But as the trajectory, at least in the European model, now you're talking about winds in the Virgin Islands that potentially could be pushing 25 plus. And you're still talking about several hundred miles away from the center of Erin. Well, Puerto Rico, that's the same thing. The North Shores, they're going to be worried about, we got northerly winds. Usually when we get northerly winds, we got something that's coming through north of the island. Well, we're talking about 15 to 20 mile an hour winds by Saturday afternoon. But now we get into Sunday. Now this is where we're expecting where the intensification could possibly get into a category 3. Well, the center of circulation of the hurricane may be 115 mile an hour winds, but you can see how expansive those winds are. And now you're talking about winds coming out of the south for the Virgin Islands, upwards of 25, maybe 30. And then you got the winds coming into Puerto Rico from the northwest, and then eventually coming in from the back end through the island from the south. That could be upwards of 30 to 35, and that's on the low end. And as far as where the position is, that's going to be the greatest thing of what Erin's going to do to the Lesser Antilles. Now, once it starts getting north, at least the Bahamian Islands may be dealing with 25 to 30 mile an hour winds, but we're talking really far away, about 300 to 400 miles away. And now also we got to talk about what it's going to do to Florida. Well, the west coast of Florida, maybe gentle breeze coming out of the southwest, but when you're talking about areas from Jacksonville Beach, St. Augustine Beach, all the way down to Melbourne, now you're talking about winds that are coming in out from the north that could be exceeding 20 to 25, maybe not big of a deal, but from Brunswick, Georgia, all the way to Myrtle Beach, and from Myrtle Beach, Grand Strand to the Outer Banks. Now you're talking about winds coming in from the north-northeast, 20 to 25 miles an hour. Now we're talking about the potential of riptides. Also, we're talking about the potential of high tides, where it could be exacerbated even by 2 or 3 feet. We're not talking about storm surge. We're now talking about the push of water coming in from the northeast. So everybody from the Outer Banks all the way down to east central coast of Florida, the winds are going to be enough that it's going to be an issue as far as riptides, and with onshore flow that'll be pushing even higher water levels as Erin moves off. The GFS almost on the same track, but keep in mind that the GFS is leaning a little bit more to the right or north of the track that the European model is doing. So yes, the winds are still going to be an issue, but not as much when we go from Friday to Sunday night from the U.S. Virgin Islands to Puerto Rico and even to Hispaniola, Dominican Republic, and Haiti. But it's getting bigger and wider. Granted, the fact that it's further north, but the American model puts the forecast winds, not only the intensity, but the expansiveness of the wind profiles exceeding 40 to 45, far wider than the European. But this track takes it to east of Bermuda. Well, Bermuda may not have the direct impact if it was on what they call the dirty side or the right side of a hurricane, but they're still going to have impacts from the winds. And that's going to be the biggest feature for really any of the Caribbean islands all the way up to Bermuda.
Yeah, I mean, you right there, you're right. They're on the better side of the storm, according to the GFS, the worst side of the storm, according to the Europeans. So That's why we have time to watch these things. That's why they have to be prepared, just like we have to be prepared for anything that can happen. You were mentioning the rip currents out there, and I think that's actually going to be not only an issue for North Carolina down to Florida, but I think all the way up to the north. And I was kind of checking because my kids went back to school here in Florida yesterday, right? And then I checked with some friends in North Carolina, and they don't go back to school until the 25th there, and I think some spots up north are a little bit later than that. So before we leave everybody tonight, let's talk about after those waves that we're going to see. I'm going to go ahead and stop it here late Sunday night into Monday, and that's when the initial swell gets into that southeast coast. You can see the storm as well down here north of Puerto Rico at that time. So Efren, how long does it look like this is going to last? You want to walk us through that?
Well, that's the thing, that the storm swells, especially for the Caribbean islands. You're talking about a duration of possibly, on the low end, 12 to 18 hours. Now, it's first going to come in from the southwest and then turn out of the northwest. But as it approaches, if it's going to take the trajectory heading towards the Bahamas and then to the east coast of Florida, Georgia, and the Carolinas, now you're talking about wave heights that could be potentially pushing 6 to 7 feet, about maybe 10 miles off the shores of the southeast Atlantic. But when you get even further out, especially get closer to Bermuda, now you're talking about wave heights that could potentially be 10 to 12 feet.
Yeah.
That is going to be an issue, not only for shipping, but that's going to be an issue for our coast.
It really is. I'm glad you mentioned shipping because there's a lot of shipping channels out there between North Carolina and Bermuda. This map that you see right here shows the swell, and these folks are not getting any wind. It's going to be regular beach weather for them, but what's going to happen is the waves Sunday night and Monday are going to start to really pick up, and I think from the Carolina northward, Jersey Shore, Ocean City, Maryland, Montauk, all those areas up the north as well are going to have a lot of surf, which means a lot of rip current risks. So if you have any friends or family there, please give them the heads up to be careful this next week. Guys, thank you very much for joining us this evening. We'll be right back here tomorrow evening as well, and hopefully we have good news and more of a fact that this thing will turn.